Well, good evening and a very warm welcome from Milim to this evening's presentation. Welcome to you wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you might be in the world. Our series of online talks and conversations continues with our guest Daniel Rachel, and I'll introduce Daniel to you in just a moment. A little bit of housekeeping first. Please do ask questions. You can do this by typing whatever you'd like to ask into the Q&A facility on your screen. As ever, we will do our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. You also have a chat facility which will allow you to send a message to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. And finally, we are recording this event and you will find it in the next day or two on our website at milim.org.uk. There you will find recordings of other past events as well as details of our future programme for which you can book tickets. And so to our guest this evening. Daniel Rachel is a former musician turned award-winning and best-selling author. His previous books include Too Much Too Young, the two-tone record story, which was a Sunday Times Book of the Year, and Isle of Noises, Conversations with Great British Songwriters, which was a Guardian and NME Book of the Year. This evening we're discussing this book, This Ain't Rock and Roll, Pop Music, the Swastika and the Third Reich, which explores the complex history of the use of Nazi symbols in popular music culture since World War II. Daniel joins us from London. Daniel, a warm welcome to you. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you for having me.
So, what was it that prompted you to write this book? Was there a particular event or catalyst or artist? How did it come about?
Well, there was a modern catalyst and then an older one from when I was a kid. The modern one was having a debate with the musician Billy Bragg, who told me that after 40 years of attempting to do so, he didn't believe music could change the world. And I go, no, you're wrong. It can. And my thoughts led to musicians in the extermination camps across Nazi-occupied Europe. And I thought, well, if you played an instrument there, that effectively saved your life, or at least extended it, and in most cases did save it. And so I actually began researching that as a book. But I soon discovered that many greater learned scholars than myself had been there before. And really I was struggling with the music, which I don't have a great affinity with pre-war music. And so I just went to my natural passion, which is rock and roll, and took the debate that way. But then I think there were two incidents in my childhood. One was I was a Sex Pistols fan, and in buying their records, I was also buying the swastika on their sleeves and in their artwork and in their songwriting. You know, they had the song Belson Was a Gas on the Great Rock and Roll Swindle. Belson was a gas I heard the other day in the open graves where the Jews all lay. Life is fun and I wish you were here. They wrote on postcards to those held dear. I was a young kid and I'd sing along to those lyrics. But at the same time, I inadvertently saw film footage of the liberation of the camps of Europe I wasn't meant to see it. It was a hidden away VHS cassette, and I took it down off a shelf that I was forbidden from touching when my parents went shopping one Saturday afternoon. And those images just indelibly stamped themselves on my mind and caused a rupture between culturally what I was listening to, the Pistols, and then historically what I was learning. And I think that journey that I then went on, discovering about the rise of the Third Reich, the persecution of the Jews, and the path to the so-called final solution. The ultimate endpoint, I think, is this book.
So that's fascinating. In fact, we had Anne Seber, the author of the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz, as a guest some months ago, and you certainly do reference those orchestras in your book at various points. Tell us something about researching this. Were there any particular challenges you faced? Where did you start when you were sort of looking for the information you needed?
Well, I've always read about the Third Reich uh, since boyhood until now. So a lot of it was refreshers, rereading Mein Kampf, rereading the Commandant of Auschwitz, rereading William L. Shearer, The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. You know, all those kind of history books. Go to Gita Sereny, finding out about Franz Stangl and Albert Speer. So a lot of Nazi literature, um, films, popular culture. A lot of it I've always watched or always read. And then on the other side, uh, uh, exploring an immense archive of music literature through the music papers from the late 50s to the present day, magazines, memoirs, anywhere I could find connections. I think the greatest single event that really defines almost the culmination of the research was I took myself on a solo 800-mile round trip of Poland. And I went to extant ghettos, and I went to all 6 extermination camps. And that was a truly incredible and moving experience.
The the structure you've chosen for the book, you've sort of split it into a number of parts. Is that a chronological structure, or is it by genre? How did you choose to put it together?
I think there's it is essentially it's chronological,
Mm.
in as much as, oddly enough, starts with Tommy Steele at the Finsbury Park Theatre in North London, and closely followed by Elvis and his great grandmother, who was Jewish, as you may know, and then into the Beatles. And as a parallel narrative, it's the persecution of Europe's Jews from the 1930s. And I ran the 2 stories in such a way that the intensity on Judaism in that period coupled itself with um, the proliferation of the swastika and Nazi ephemera in rock and roll. Most recently, as I'm sure half the world is probably aware of, Kanye West, um, and what he's been responsible for in only the last few weeks. A single with the chorus Sieg Heil, and I use the word chorus intentionally because it is a chorus of voices all singing Sieg Heil, and then his permit to come to the UK, to Australia, to Austria, various other European countries being rescinded by the governments of the day, which is fascinating, really, because
Mhm.
rock and roll has had license to behave with impunity, to show and do whatever it wants to, in particular regard to images of the Third Reich, and it's taken a government to intercede after 80 years. that long, really. You know, rock and roll traditionally hates the establishment, but it couldn't sort itself out. It needed help.
Although what Kanye West has been doing is perhaps slightly different to what the Beatles were doing. You could argue West is seriously Nazi, whereas John Lennon was perhaps trying to be funny, probably not very successfully.
Maybe. I mean, parts of John Lennon's behaviour and the Beatles' behaviour is certainly linked to the fact that they were born in the war and they had direct connection with the conflict, and that obviously has a tremendous impact on anybody. If you and in John Lennon's case, he collected Nazi memorabilia, and as a child, he drew himself as Adolf Hitler, and on a podium. And instead of writing the words as he did in ink pen, Sieg Heil, he wrote Heil John multiple times, and he drew badges of the Hitler Youth in quite a lot of detail. Those ink drawings were only revealed after his death, as was his Nazi memorabilia collection. And his first wife, Cynthia, describing how he used to wear items of those collection on his person. But you know, at the as I describe in the book, one particular incident that's quite weird is when the Beatles were at the premiere of A Hard Day's Night, both in Australia and in Liverpool, in front of hundreds of thousands of fans. In fact, 200,000, I believe, in Liverpool. And John and Paul both Sieg Heil. There's photographs of it, and it's on film. And in fact, Ringo tells them off to calm it, John. You know, but you know, there is an element of lampooning, but obviously with John Lennon, there was something a little deeper going on. And I think that touches on a theme that reoccurs throughout the book, which is rock stars who are given a endowed status in a vast situation where they're worshipped by their fans. They see a link between what was happening at Nuremberg rallies and the footage of Leni Riefenstahl. And they can see that, as David Bowie talked about, that Adolf Hitler was the first rock and roll superstar, as did Gene Simmons of Kiss, who was born in Haifa in Israel, as did Brian Ferry, as did Mick Jagger. They made that connection that your control of a crowd and their willingness to do whatever you so demand of them is inherent in not only the political rallies of Adolf Hitler, but in rock concerts. One only need to think of Freddie Mercury, for example, at Live Aid, and I'm sure everybody can remember the images of the whole, 80,000 people at Wembley, in unison, clapping their hands or hands out and doing the signals, which I'm not saying for one moment that was a Nazi gesture, but it shows you the link between a rock concert and a Nuremberg rally.
So you touch on two things that come up again and again and again. One is the rock stars collecting Nazi memorabilia, which seems to happen too much for it to be mere coincidence. And secondly, an obsession with the films of Leni Riefenstahl, which I suppose to some extent you could understand if you're trying to put on a spectacle, you might sort of learn something from that. But it just seems to be there with all of them. And you mention a huge number of musicians and stars in the book. I don't know if there's anything else you feel there is to say about either of those things, or indeed both of them.
Well, the Leni Riefenstahl was an incredible filmmaker, and captures something quite amazing, really. But at the same time, she's hugely compromised as a person for her very close relationship with Adolf Hitler. They joked in the early 30s, will Adolf and Leni have a child together? That was the joke that did the rounds of Berlin. She was funded by Goebbels and directly in contact with the elite of the party. She witnessed an atrocity in Poland, and she used extras on, I believe you pronounce it Tiefland, a film that was not released until after into the 50s, but she filmed it in the 40s. And those extras, I think, were taken to Auschwitz and possibly also Majdanek. And so hugely compromised. But I think more importantly, what Leni Riefenstahl's film of Triumph of the Will, which has a massive impact on rock and roll musicians. So many of them, as you alluding to, talk about it in the film for many different reasons. But I think that what's essentially been captured in that film and what people are admiring is the extraordinary talent of Albert Speer, Hitler's architect. His talent at creating 100-foot golden eagle, the stone abutments that Hitler would speak, and the podium that he spoke from, the rows and rows of flags, and the way, the positioning of all the people that came to the rally over the week in their blocks, the streets of Nuremberg. All this was Speer's thinking, and that showed an incredible theatrical mind. That he put that to this end is horrific. And yet, in the British media, particularly I'm aware of in the 1970s, he was the good Nazi. That's how he was always introduced. And yet again, thankfully to historians, and in particular Gita Sereny, he was revealed to know about the camps when he spent so long trying to deny that he did. And but yeah, people would watch those films, talk about it, and it's frightening, really, that this was used. I mean, you take a modern artist like Nicki Minaj in America, and she did a video which recreates in graphic illustration a Nuremberg rally, and the only difference is instead of a swastika banners on either side of the stage, she replaced it with the initials of her record company. But beyond that, it's identical to Speer's work through the camera eye of Leni Riefenstahl.
One artist you write about who was a big fan of Hitler's rallies, he said they were almost like rock concerts, also collects memorabilia, wears Nazi clothes, is Lemmy from Motorhead.
Yeah.
What I think is interesting that you point out about Motorhead, which stares anybody in the face, is the use of the umlaut in the name and the sort of Gothic typeface. But they're not alone in doing that. There are quite a lot of bands who used both of those devices. Is it some kind of coded message that they've got this is like a secret handshake that they sort of admire Nazi imagery? I mean, there's quite a number, aren't there, that use both of those
many
devices.
bands, Joy Division used them on their names, and Motley Crue and Queensryche and loads and loads of bands. But in and of itself, there's no connection between that and Nazism because it predates it. What it's suggesting is an affiliation with something to do with Germany or that language, but it's what it's then coupled with, which then makes it more disturbing, because it's trying to use the umlaut and various other factors to signify a way of thinking. So if you take Motorhead, the first album that they released has a swastika on the front cover of the image of the logo that you use, a person they call Snaggletooth. That was deleted eventually, that cover, but it was that Lemmy's former band, his first band Hawkwind, came onto the sound of I think from the Nuremberg rallies, the sounds of speeches and audiences and whatever else. And he used to dress in SS uniform. He used to get into a German tank. And I think there's a very critical difference here in that John Lennon's collection of Nazi memorabilia and his playfulness with it, with a pen and paper, was private and was kept private all of his life. And it was only because, you know, posthumously we found out about that, not his intent. But with Lemmy, he made a documentary where he invited cameras into his home. And in his house is a room dedicated, it's a shrine to Nazism, massive swastika flags, you know, the daggers, implements of all kinds, books. And he proudly goes through them and shares them. But there's what's fascinating to my mind is there's no contextualization or understanding of why he keeps this stuff. He simply says, you know, the Nazis had the best uniforms. If the Israelis had the best uniforms, he'd wear those, so he says. So I went to his memoir, because what I do in the book, I try not to point an accusing finger. I just lay out history, saying this is what was said, this is what was done. Here are the incidents, here are the patterns. As a reader, you discover for yourself and decide for yourself. And then in many cases, the artist pretty much hangs themselves just by admitting to doing that. But in Lemmy's case, in his memoir, he extols the virtues of the Nazi Party, and particularly Adolf Hitler, in which he said, this is Lemmy speaking now, Hitler said he would turn around the economy. He did. Hitler said he would roll out the Autobahn. He did. Hitler said he would kill all the Jews. He did. And at that point, I thought, right, he'll now add some understanding and insight, and he leaves it at that, no more. I found that very surprising.
And of course, the idea of these uniforms being very smart is again something that comes up over and over with several of the artists you talk about. One of whom, I suppose, even more than others, is known for his clothing and his looks is David Bowie. Perhaps he's even a focal point of the book. And you mention this persona, the thin white duke, which in his own words is an Aryan fascist type. Yeah. And it seems it's excused because maybe he's playing a character, maybe he's taken too much cocaine. But he says himself, Hitler's on his way back. Is there perhaps a darker fascination than we care to admit with Bowie and Nazism?
I mean, I've been a David Bowie fan as long as I've liked rock music, and I own pretty much every LP he's ever made. And, you know, this isn't a book about my likes and dislikes. But what I have become aware of in reading literature around David Bowie is a reluctance to understand the man completely. Because if you do not mention his absolute deep fascination with Nazism, you're getting nowhere near the mindset of the man in the 1970s. He was a man in 1968 that was starting to talk about the need for Britain needing a fascist leader. And still by 1983, 15 years later, he was singing of swastikas in China Girl. And in between that, I mean, that's a long time to be on coke. I mean, I've had a fair go at coke in my time, and you can't do for 15 years, every minute of the day, hour, day after day, week after week, endlessly. And even if he had, and you want to use that in some way to dismiss what he says, then you also must dismiss every record and concert and artistic creative choice he's ever made. Because you can't say coke, Nazi, brush it that way, but all the brilliant records and the tours, but that's on this side and we like that, so that's okay. It's nonsense, you know. And brilliantly with David Bowie, particularly in the 1990s, he was open and tried to make sense to the public in interviews why he had such a fascination. A lot of it was to do with the Arthurian legend, the Holy Grail, which in and of itself is about the search to justify the so-called Aryan type. We know that Himmler, led SS teams all the way back to the island of Atlantis in a desperate need to justify that there is an Aryan. So that was one strand that he was massively interested in, alongside Nietzsche and various other mystical practices. On the other hand, he had a big Nazi memorabilia collection, and he was intending to make a film about Goebbels. And David Bowie owned Joseph Goebbels' desk. Can you imagine what was signed at that?
Mm.
So
Wow.
again, I go from what I try to do in the book is patterns of behavior. If there's a one-off incident, somebody wears a swastika or an iron cross, and it once is hard to pin anything on, but when David Bowie, I mean, it's just like stacking and stacking. It's like the Capitol Records building in LA, it's just like layers and layers and layers, and goes on up to the sky, So,
And I suppose what's so dangerous is how idolized he is, and how I mean, I've certainly come across people who dress like him, who look like him, who just obsess about every detail of the man. So
well, we
it's
do. We love our
yeah,
pop stars, and
yeah,
I
yeah,
love
yeah.
my rock stars, and I have to say that I'm as culpable as anybody. I bought the Sex Pistols records and I sung along to them, and I bought those Bowie records. I'm not for one moment advocating burning records. We know what happened when the Nazis burnt books in the 30s, where that leads to. But what we can do is recognize our history and not deny it. And rock and roll has to accept its failures and face up to something that it's for whatever reason, and those reasons are important to uncover. But it has to acknowledge that it's let itself down, because it's not when rock and roll is at its greatest. It's not it's not because of discrimination against minority groups, for sure. And I think if people listening are debating or struggling with this argument, I think there's two ways to create an image. And one of those is, if we were not talking about the swastika and we were talking about a black person, and we replaced images of the swastika with, say, a lynching from the South in the 60s, that would not be allowed in the modern day and would not make it onto the front of record covers or T-shirts. Or, for example, if we were talking about rape, and we freely used acts of male violence against women in the modern age, I would say that there would be an outcry. And yet, when we talk about the swastika and images, then there's more debate. Oh, is this okay? Is this not okay? It was only in November when the British dance rock act Primal Scream displayed at a big venue in North London a swastika entwined in the Star of David, and claimed that wasn't an anti-Semitic symbol. The Star of David, as we well know, is linked to Judaism for thousands of years. And, there's a deep history of Primal Scream, and they're about to go on tour in the autumn, and to do an album from it's almost 25 years old, and it contains a song called Swastika Eyes. Now, in the history of Primal Scream, has Bobby Gillespie Sieg Heiling while he's performed Swastika Eyes. And I think, in the light of what's happened with Kanye West, where ultimately Pepsi and other advertisers finally did due diligence and said, we can't sponsor this event because of what it's promoting, which in that instant was going to be anti-Semitism. I wonder if anybody will do due diligence on this up and coming tour of Primal Scream, because that song's on the album. They'll be performing it. What will be shown on stage? What will be performed on stage?
Well, we'll maybe come back to Primal Scream a bit later, because I think there's another interesting twist in the evolution of this this with them. Um, but to come back to what you were saying earlier about singing along to the Sex Pistols, I mean, I remember this well. I remember being a teenager at school, young teenager, and the whole Ronnie Biggs thing happening, and
Yeah,
it was abhorrent, but we thought it was wonderful because it was rebellious and it was anti-establishment,
exactly.
and it was all over the tabloids. And if I remember rightly, my attitude to it, the shock factor outweighed the seriousness, the sort of anti-establishment nature of it outweighed in my youthful mind the seriousness of it. But this wasn't being put out by 13 and 14-year-olds. It was being put out by adults. And I think that's what
Mm.
makes it dangerous.
Well, behind it all was Malcolm McLaren,
Yeah.
who managed the Pistols, and McLaren was bar mitzvah and grew up in a Jewish community where they spoke Yiddish in Stamford Hill and Stoke Newington in North London. And it's a part of the book is not just to look at the musician, it's to look at the management, to look at the record label, to look at the journalists of the time, to see who's talking, who's discussing, who's challenging. Now, I would say one of the most fascinating questions that you could possibly put to Malcolm McLaren is why, with such a deep Jewish upbringing, did you feel it was necessary or have a desire to put the swastika into rock and roll? He handed them out at the punk rock
But he
festival.
was selling it in his shop.
He
It
was
was, I
selling
mean,
it
it
in his shop.
wasn't just putting it out with rock and roll. He was actually selling the memorabilia on the King's Road
Exactly.
or off the
First
King's
person
Road.
to be doing
Yeah.
that. The first person. Why? And now I spoke to somebody else, and I can't find the question that puts that to him.
Mm.
In all of his lifestyle, all of his life, the nearest you can come to is vacuous comments like, "We were doing it to demystify the image." Now, I said to myself, what does demystify mean? The origin of that word is mystery. What's the mystery of the swastika? It's nonsense. It's nonsense. But the other person I spoke to was his partner, Bernie Rhodes. Bernie Rhodes managed the Clash,
Mm.
and he fell out and refused to work ever again with Malcolm McLaren over the swastika because he would not allow bands to use that image when the Clash were involved. And and that's really fascinating because there was the line in the sand at that moment in 1976. And so when we talk about punk in the book, you go, which side are you on? The side that did display the swastika, did do all manner of things connected with the Third Reich over quite a long period of time, or were you those that were against it? But even those that were against, in Rock Against Racism and the so-called anti-Nazi League, you might have thought that the lessons would take you back to the 1930 when you teach about that modern history. And I've written a book about Rock Against Racism.
Mm.
It's an incredible organization that transformed a youth generation to be anti-racist, and yet you can find histories of Mozambique, of Ireland, of violence against women, of violence against bouncers. You can find all manner of histories, but one thing you cannot find in their literature is anything to do with the history of persecution of Jewish people or the Holocaust.
Yeah, well, it was a question I'd noted here that you've obviously said a lot about Rock Against Racism, and the fact that the neo-Nazi activity was nothing to do in their mind with rising anti-Semitism. It was purely discrimination against black people. I suppose you've explained that it did have a positive impact on racism, but it seems it didn't have an impact on the use of Nazi imagery. Missed the point.
Yeah, and to all her credit, I spoke to one member of Rock Against Racism and asked her directly, for the original committee, and she said it was a blind spot that she hadn't noticed.
It's
And
remarkable.
I admired her bravery for talking to me about it. I admired her for admitting it, and I accepted her shame that they had not done that. And I think that was brilliant that she did that.
Just going back to punk for a second, I was very interested to read about Susie and the Banshees, which I remember as the sort of top of the pops act, and obviously there was a life to that band before they became so well known. And having read about her use of the swastika, I actually looked on Google for images of Susie Sue swastika. There's nothing. It's almost as if it's whitewashed.
Where are you? What country are
Well,
you in?
I'm only telling you what I've
Are you
observed.
in Leeds?
Yeah, couldn't find
No,
it.
it's all over.
Really,
It's easy to find. Yeah.
I couldn't find it, and
Oh,
I
I'm
hadn't
shocked.
remembered it.
Well, that's
I felt
brilliant.
maybe
Maybe you've got a block.
she'd been
Brilliant, Tony.
sanitized, she'd been whitewashed. She's sort of been made made sort of friendly for the sort of level of commercial success she achieved later on.
Huh. I'm very surprised by that. I should I should have flashed them up for you if I'd known. No, there's plenty. And I
I
know
found
the,
plenty of Sid Vicious, lots of him
yeah.
with swastikas, but I couldn't find one of her. Anyway, maybe I looked in
No,
the wrong place.
there's a picture where she's strutting and she's got just like virtually no clothes on
Yeah.
and an armband, and then there's a few where she's out on Oxford Street in London with an armband on, and
Mm,
given to her by Malcolm McLaren.
mm,
Then she wrote that she didn't write it. She sang the song "Love in a Void." Too many Jews for my liking.
mm,
Lyrics written by the bass player Steve Severin. They performed that for a couple of years. They she said that she's fed up of people banging on about the war. And this is the way to get back at them. And then she released a song called Mitigessen,
mm, mm.
which was, if you know about Nazi history, this is taken from a speech by Goering, and it's about iron ore and butter. Now that isn't a top of the pops hit, is it?
No,
Speech
not
that's
at
quite
all.
obscure.
Yeah. Well,
And
it
and
wasn't on top of the pops, in
no, but I mean,
fairness.
as a
Yeah.
like one of the
Yeah.
great well-known speeches. That's cool. And then she sang that in German,
Yeah.
and and then you see the imagery, that goes with it. This is somebody that did know about German history at the same time as proclaiming that she knew nothing. But then she would say, well, as did many punks, not just Susie Sue, but have you not seen Salon Kitty? Have you not seen The Producers? Have you not seen The Night Porter? Well, I have seen all of those films, and I've particularly seen The Night Porter and Salon Kitty. Salon
Mm,
Kitty is a kind of uh, a pornographic sexual romp with the images of the Third Reich playing on film in fetishistic sex scenes with people dressed in Nazi uniforms, and then perhaps more familiar is The Night Porter, which was caricatured by Lady Gaga, caricatured by Madonna, and that's about, as you may know, a relationship between a former SS guard and an inmate who have a sexual relationship in, we don't know if it's a death camp or a concentration camp, the distinction being very important. And then they renew that in post-war Austria. And it's a deeply disturbing psychological sexual sadomasochistic film. And many punks reference that. So for all of their, we're against the system, we're shoving it in the man, we don't want to hear about your war, on this hand, on the other hand, they make all the references to the Nazi things they do like and watch. So it's
yeah.
contradiction, but life is contradiction.
And that film again comes up over and over again.
Yeah.
The Night Porter comes up over and over again. Um, you talk about this ambiguity, but I think there's also an ambiguity about which side of the fence the bands were on. I get the impression that they were sort of claimed by anti-Nazis, and some of them were claimed by fascists, but it wasn't exactly clear cut which side some of these bands were on, and in terms of their audiences.
Mm.
Um, Do you think that was a deliberate thing, or do you think?
Well, I think what this is about essentially is that rock and roll feels licensed to divorce theatrical spectacle from historical atrocity.
Hmm.
And that, and my purpose in the book is to realign the flirtation with anything to do with the Third Reich to its historical context. To say, you can't talk about Joy Division or think about Joy Division unless it's abundantly clear to all the origin of the name. Now, for those who don't know, it's the name of the brothel in Auschwitz. As you go through the gates, Arbeit macht frei, the first building you see, first floor, that's where one of the brothels were. There were brothels across the whole Nazi camp network. Legalized rape because Heinrich Himmler feared homosexuality. So he offered incentive to workers and say, let's give them women if they work harder, and then we'll take the women from Ravensbrück. And state-sanctioned rape. And there were brothels also outside of the camps for SS soldiers. And then, as we know, rape is a weapon of war, whatever the country and whatever the time anyway. You know, as Stalin freely admitted, they were using it as they came from the East. All armies do it. But here, they were using women expressly on the promise that they may get released after 6 months, or they may get an extra smidgen of bread. And the two members of Joy Division, Bernard Sumner and Ian Curtis, read about this in a book by a Holocaust survivor called House of Dolls. And they took the name from that page. Incidentally, on the adjacent page, it references the band, the name New Order, which Joy Division evolved into New Order. And in fact, on the first Joy Division single, there is a spoken word piece from the book House of Dolls, which talks about a teenage girl from Poland, the Czechoslovakia then, Daniela, who is tortured and used for medical experimentation. And that's the passage they choose to read. That's one of, again, if you, as I referenced before, patterns of behavior within Joy Division. But why they're doing that and why other people are doing it, well, I don't know if they're Nazis or they're ideologically aligned with Nazi thinking, or it's just for theatrical spectacle.
But
That's
they
for the reader
they
to decide.
denied there was any connection, didn't they? I mean, it stares you in the face.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, I mean, Bernard Sumner in his memoir, is regretful of his behaviour and said he wouldn't have done that in hindsight. But I have to add that I can't remember exactly the year. It's within the last 5 years that New Order were opening shows with footage, including Riefenstahl's 1936 Berlin Olympics footage, and they used that then image on the front cover of a live album. So returning to what they were initially doing in 1977, 8, 9, 80.
I'd always thought Adam Ant was a bit of fun, was um, not that serious, and yet apparently one of his heroes is Ilse Koch,
Yeah.
quite a nasty uh, individual. He says he's done nothing wrong. He played Rock Against Racism, albeit with a sort of health and safety notice. Also connected through Malcolm McLaren. I don't think that was mentioned in the book, but McLaren managed him for a time.
Well, McLaren, for a brief period, Adam Ant paid for his services,
Yeah.
up to something like £1,000 in return. Got a long speech and a cassette, which influenced the move away from being a punk band into using the Burundi rhythms. But no, Adam Ant's interesting because he, at the time, he was separating his persona on stage to what he was off stage, and called anybody a fool, basically. They couldn't see the difference. But yeah, he did speak to the press about his latest love and fascination was Ilse Koch, and he'd written a song about her, and he he again pulled out producers. Has nobody seen that? Has nobody seen The Night Porter? Why don't people understand that this is us doing this? And yet, and then famously Deutsche Girls became a hit single just as the Ants split up, and he had a German dance group performing on Top of the Pops because he wouldn't promote the record. But it was, and that originally, when he recorded that for the Derek Jarman film Jubilee, talked explicitly about Nazis in the lyric, which were changed or sung differently for the version that became the hit single. But yeah, I mean, the drummer of that band had a Jewish mother, had a black father, and he was very outspoken, both graphically in his support for Rock Against Racism and in interviews to point out that he wasn't a Nazi and he was enjoying the sexual fetishism and attraction he enjoyed. But that, as you mentioned earlier, is very much wrapped up in the costume designs of Walter Heck and Carl de Beach, and then famously manufactured by Hugo Boss, that these uniforms, as Susan Sontag wrote a brilliant essay for the New York Review in 1976, talking about that fetishism, sexualization of a uniform was built into its very design. Because, of course, in 1929-30, the Nazi Party needed to be attractive to people, the modern society of Germany would vote for them. And part of that was the uniform, and something that was beautiful, very tailored, with intricate attention to buttons, to shiny parts of it, and lining and whatever else. And that was all part of fear, attraction, menace, sexualization, fetishization built into the look of the uniform, which is again why so many rock stars choose elements from it and say, but it's wonderful, it's beautiful, it's attractive, because that's built into the ideology of Nazism.
Let's touch on two-tone. You've written about this label previously, and you mentioned a comment Jerry Dammers made in 1982. The Israelis are stooping to the same level as the Nazis, which you reference as being naive at best. But this accusation hasn't really gone away. And if we come back to Primal Scream more recently, they are also very anti-Israel. Do you see, I suppose, in a similar way that anti-Semitism morphs over time, that this obsession with Nazi imagery is also perhaps morphing in a way where Israel becomes part of the conversation and part of what some of these artists are pitching themselves against?
Well, in the case of Primal Scream, I mean, there was an incident at Glastonbury when all the artists were asked to sign a massive banner that said "Make Poverty History," and the lead singer Bobby Gillespie crossed that out and wrote "Make Israel History." And then he was on the BBC Newsnight programme where he was asked by the anchor, you can understand why there's accusations of anti-Semitism. The sad thing is, in the modern age, is the actions of what happens in the Hamas war against Israel has a direct effect on British Jews across the world. And in our country here, we're just seeing attacks almost weekly ever since 7th of October. And it's a great shame when the connection between what's happening in the Middle East means that there's fear and danger for Jewish people, when that doesn't seem to be what the issue is about, or what the artists are saying it's not. They don't say it's not about Judaism, but that is the knock-on effect for sure. And it's a great shame that there isn't a recognition of that And there was a march at the weekend in London to speak out against anti-Semitic attacks and to say we as a nation support British Jews. And apart from Boy George, I've not heard any other names from the rock and roll fraternity that backed that march openly. And yet, I'm sure next week, when what's called a pro-Palestine march happens, I suspect there'll be a lot of musicians involved in that.
Yeah, I suppose perhaps I could have phrased it a bit better in the same way that that Nazi imagery is considered cool, Palestinian imagery and garments are also considered cool, although they perhaps don't have quite the same connotations for many people.
Probably
Yeah.
like yourself. I mean, I'm not qualified to talk about the Middle East. I learned about it to a degree when I was growing up. I've never been
Mm,
to Israel. I can't begin to understand conflict of land if I've never even trodden the land. And I think when things get reduced to simplicities, for example, free Palestine, I don't know what that means. Does that mean from Hamas? What,
probably not, but yes,
oh, okay, right.
it's a good point. Um, what can we talk about? We've got a few minutes left. If anybody has a question, please put it into the Q&A now. We have a question from one viewer, Simon Marcus. He said, have you come across the story of offence taken by the title of the Beatles, Hey Jude, which is in fact written about John Lennon's son and had nothing to do with the German word for Jew?
It's in the book. Yeah, it
Yeah.
was. Um, uh, it was the opening of the Apple shop um, in 967, 8. So, and Paul McCartney, the window was whitewashed, and Paul McCartney scratched out Jude, and he got a phone call saying, "We're going to come and kill you." And he's like, "What?" And of course,
What have
it's
I
in a Jewish
done?
community, Baker Street, and Paul McCartney discovered that the word Jude was used on shop
Mm.
windows in the 30s. She's the first image in the book, This Ain't Rock and Roll, and uh, and was hugely apologetic,
Mm.
And I mean, Paul McCartney's had two Jewish wives, hasn't he?
Yeah.
Current one, and let's not forget
Yeah,
the lovely Linda.
Linda.
Yeah,
Um, so you also write about the New Romantic movement in the 1980s.
yeah,
Uh, Really quite shameless use of haircuts and clothes and Spandau ballet and all of that kind of thing. Very much in your face, and yet nobody said anything. Do you think the music media perhaps have something to answer for here?
absolutely. I mean, there was a display at the Design Museum in Holland Park,
Mm,
West London, only recently, and the opening room has got images of a swastika on a T-shirt and images of the night porter without contextualization. The Observer um, reported on that, the Sunday newspaper, with a double spread, and within there was three or four photographs, and one of them was Lemmy from Motorhead wearing Nazi costumes with a swastika on. Now, I would have thought that at least deserved some kind of contextualization in the description, and yet nothing. And that points to what I mentioned earlier about, yes, there is responsibility of the media to at least contextualize, or an exhibition to make sense of why they're showing a swastika to do with a new romantic exhibition, and yet there was nothing.
I think that's very interesting, and particularly how anything with a sniff of colonialism is contextualized in pretty much every other museum in this country. Barbara Nichols says, wasn't the use of elaborate military uniforms by the Beatles supposed to be ironic. I don't think you particularly mentioned their military uniforms, do you?
Yeah, I mean, John Lennon wore military uniforms all the way through to Shea Stadium, didn't he? And
Mm,
the one thing I didn't do in the book was fill in gaps of knowledge.
mm,
So, whether the Beatles or John Lennon was doing that, you know, for humor, for lampooning, for whatever, I didn't presuppose that. And with any artist, I actually went to find the evidence to see what they said, and did they ever say these things? We're doing it because, or a punk artist, we're doing it to shock, or are these words that we fill in the gaps with because we want to think the best of our heroes? I want to think the best of my heroes,
mm,
and I think a modern day illustration was that I've done various live events for this book, and one of them was a Rough Trade with Billy Bragg, and when I told the audience that I was as culpable as anybody for some of my actions in the past, Billy Bragg shocked everybody and said, "I'm culpable," and he didn't talk about Nazism because he's not, but he was. He said with his use of Russian imagery, and
mm.
he felt that that needed a reappraisal, and he felt that that was now um, yeah, he was basically saying he was culpable, and that he's never said that ever in public before. I just saw John Lennon's name flashed up, but I missed what the question was.
Um, this was about what about German artists who are not legally within Germany allowed to use Nazi iconography?
Yeah, and that's caused all manner of problems because British bands who have used swastikas on their sleeves or in their stage shows fall foul of German law, where you cannot
Yeah.
display the swastika. And so that's led to all kinds of incidents. It led to Pete Doherty of the Libertines being marched off stage because he sang the forbidden verse of Deutschland über alles. As did Nico for the former
Mm,
Chanteaus of the Velvet Underground. It's Roger Waters has run into trouble because of that. Various sleeves of various artists have had to be
mm,
covered, banned, changed, all manner of things. The Skids, a lesser known band, perhaps ran into trouble because their front cover was the 1936 Berlin Olympics. And Virgin Records eventually pulled it. But interesting enough, that band who have been on tour in the last couple of years are reusing the
mm.
Berlin Nazi Olympics iconography to advertise their album of the past, which they were banned from, which the record company then withdrew, and now they're reusing it. Nobody cares.
So, we've got time for a couple of quick questions. I wondered how writing this book might have affected your relationship with your own record collection.
Out they go, all out the window. No, it's weird, really, because you can you can listen to Michael Jackson,
Mm,
you can dance to Billie Jean or Thriller,
mm.
and not hear him talking about interfering with young boys, if allegedly that's what he did.
But he's also in your book with some Nazi
Yes,
tendencies
he
as
is.
well. Yes.
Yes, he is. But with some of this stuff, it's blatant. It's on you. If I pull
Mm,
out my Sex Pistols various records, I can listen to blatant anti-Semitism. So that
mm,
becomes problematic, I guess.
mm,
Um, I actually haven't. I don't know if I've listened to Belson Was a Gas since I've been writing this book
mm.
again, and the various associated tracks. Obviously, while I was writing for research, I did. But no, it's curious how we deal with it. I think we just have to acknowledge it and recognize it, as I was saying earlier.
Yeah,
Gary
that's about
Glitter,
Gary Glitter.
Gary Glitter
We're
being
not
a
talking
bit.
about Gary Glitter. So so you've written quite a few books now about music. Have you got something else in the pipeline?
Oh, always.
Yeah.
There's always some.
Anything you want to share or
Hello, my publisher's just turned it down, so I need to find
oh
somebody
right, it
else.
needs to
So,
find someone else.
so maybe
Yeah.
I'll jinx it if I talk about it.
Right. Okay. Well, you're
If anybody's got
forgiven.
an idea,
I'm
right?
sure we all have. It's been a real joy to talk to you. This book's available from all good bookshops. It's meticulously researched. It's really well written, and it's full of surprises. You will be astounded who is in it. And to say thank you, I'll send you a book of some of my pictures of the diversity of Israeli citizens, which hopefully you will enjoy looking through. Now, just a few brief words about our upcoming programme before we leave you. We're off now until the 1st of June, when Douglas Century will be speaking about his book Crash of the Heavens. This is the remarkable story of Hannah Senesh and the only military mission to rescue Europe's Jews during World War II. To book, please visit milim.org.uk, and you can sign up to our newsletter there. That way you will be sure to be the first to hear about everything we're doing. All these online events are free, but you can make a donation if you like to help with the cost of our programming. There's a link in the chat, also on our website. This is our 10th anniversary. We are hoping to raise £5,000 to help fund our programme going forward, so please do give generously. It remains for me to thank our guest, Daniel Rachel, once again. Thank you so much, Daniel. It's been a real joy to chat to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for having me, and I can see some lovely messages popping up, and so I do appreciate everybody that's been listening. Thank you for that,
and looking forward to seeing you all next time. Until then, stay safe. See you soon.